Hey guys, tonight we're going to start with a house that is elegant, candlelit, and, well, quietly homicidal. I'm talking about the Victorian home, a place of polished furniture, fine wallpapers, and death hidden away in every little detail. So before you settle in and get comfortable, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. And do let me know in the comments where you happen to be tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always so fascinating to see who is joining us from all corners of the globe. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Step inside a respectable Victorian townhouse, and you will feel it almost immediately. It's that faint scent of lavender, of pride, and of something that is quietly trying to kill you. The very air seems to hum with the confidence of an empire that was convinced science could fix just about anything, except maybe common sense. Everything inside simply gleams. The mahogany furniture is polished to such a high shine that you can see your own reflection, which is a nice touch considering it's probably the last clear image your lungs will ever get to process. Thick velvet curtains are there to block out both the sunlight and any fresh air, creating the perfect sort of atmosphere for fainting in a stylish manner. Every single corner looks like it's been dusted with progress, and it usually has, often in the form of arsenic. In the Victorian way of thinking, domestic comfort was nothing short of a moral duty. A clean home was supposed to mean a pure soul. Apparently, a pure soul also meant filling your house with all sorts of experimental chemicals and just calling it good taste. To live well was to die in a fashionable way, and the middle class was absolutely determined to do both of those things. Coal fires coughed out soot like they were dying dragons. Gas lamps would whisper poison into the air all night long. And the wallpapers released microscopic death with the same enthusiasm as a scented candle. Dinner guests would compliment the vibrant atmosphere, completely unaware that they were inhaling the very same compound used to kill rats and unfaithful spouses. The furniture wasn't safe either. Upholstery was often stuffed with horsehair, treated with formaldehyde, and weighed down with heavy iron nails, which was perfect for surviving exactly one generation before collapsing into a pile of dust and regret. Rugs were designed as tripping hazards. Floors were waxed to a lethally perfect shine, and the staircases were just narrow enough to ensure an instant widowhood for someone. And cleaning the house certainly didn't help matters. The new miracle cleaning agents on the market could burn through grime and also human skin. Housewives scrubbed away until their hands glowed bright red with the satisfaction of industrial-grade poisoning. Nothing quite said, "I love my family," like slowly dissolving your own epidermis in the name of good hygiene. And yet, the Victorians absolutely loved it all. They called it modern living. To them, these homes were grand monuments to progress, glowing with the light of gas lamps and optimism, and also, occasionally, actual combustion. So, when you picture the Victorian era as a gentile and romantic time, just remember, underneath all that lace and all those manners was a house so full of poison it could kill you before you even had breakfast. But at least you die in a room that matched the drapes. If the Victorian home had a favorite color, it was undoubtedly death. More specifically, a cheerful and welcoming shade of green. This wasn't the natural green of meadows or mint leaves, but Scheele's green, a brilliant, luminous pigment that owed all of its charm to one simple ingredient: arsenic. It was invented in the late 18th century and quickly became the most fashionable color of the 19th. Every respectable family wanted their parlor walls to shimmer with it. Children's bedrooms, drawing rooms, and even elegant ball gowns glowed with that soft, toxic sheen. It was truly the color of envy, of elegance, and of chronic respiratory distress. When it was burned under candlelight, arsenic green wallpaper didn't just look beautiful, it performed. The heat would loosen tiny particles of poison that drifted gently throughout the air, landing on teacups, furniture, and, of course, human lungs. Guests would often comment, "The room feels so alive," and in a microbial sense, it certainly was. Doctors of the time just couldn't figure it out. Entire families kept mysteriously coughing, vomiting, and then dying. But the very idea that interior decoration could be lethal just sounded completely absurd to them. After all, beauty was progress, and progress never killed anyone except for, nearly everyone. By the 1860s, the reports really started piling up. Factory workers who were making the dye were dropping like flies. A London woman nearly expired from green dust poisoning while she was just cleaning her curtains. One chemist tried to scrape a small sample from his own wallpaper, and he nearly blacked out before he could even reach the window for some fresh air. That really should have been the end of it, but fashion doesn't go down without a fight. Magazines kept on praising the color's refreshing vitality. Aristocrats kept ordering more of it, and the manufacturers, when confronted with the data, responded exactly as you would expect them to, by denying absolutely everything. One even suggested that their customers should just stop licking the wallpaper. It was sound advice, of course, but it was also missing the point entirely. Children's toys, playing cards, artificial flowers, they all got the same deadly makeover. If something could be painted, it could be poisoned. The Victorian home wasn't just decorated, it was essentially embalmed while still alive. Still, homeowners insisted that the shade was simply divine, which, technically speaking, it was, since it sent so many people directly on their way to the afterlife. So yes, the Victorians really did love their green. It brightened up the parlor, it impressed the neighbors, and it slowly turned your skin the exact same color as the wallpaper. Interior design had never been so consistently fatal. If the Victorian walls were actively trying to kill you, your wardrobe was more than happy to assist. Fashion, after all, was the great equalizer of the time. Everyone could die in style. The 19th century was truly an age where elegance came first, oxygen came second, and medical knowledge was languishing somewhere near the back of the line. The arsenic didn't just stop at the wallpaper. It followed you right out the door. That stunning emerald ball gown shimmering beautifully beneath the gaslight. It glowed because it was coated with the very same pigment used to kill rats. Dressmakers handled it on a daily basis, coughing up green dust while their clients twirled blissfully in gowns that could easily double as chemical weapons. And it wasn't just women either. Men's waistcoats, gloves, and even the linings of their hats were often dyed with the same toxic shade, because nothing says refined masculinity quite like slow, systemic poisoning. Those vivid green cravats that were so beloved by gentlemen were so toxic that newspapers joked you could strangle a man simply by adjusting his tie. And then, of course, there was the makeup. Victorian ladies didn't just want to look beautiful, they wanted to look slightly deceased. The ideal complexion was a ghostly white, which was achieved with a thick dusting of lead carbonate and arsenic powder. It gave the skin a luminous pallor and, over time, a very convincing preview of one's own funeral. Perfumes weren't much safer. Many were blended with chloroform or benzene, which meant you could smell absolutely divine right up until your kidneys decided to stop trying. But the women adored it. The faint feeling of dizziness was considered part of the charm. When doctors began warning the public about arsenic-laced fabrics, Victorians were outraged. Surely, they insisted, something so fashionable couldn't possibly be fatal. One journalist famously described the dresses as killingly beautiful. He wasn't exaggerating in the slightest. Factory workers would collapse in the middle of their shifts. Dancers coughed up blood right on stage. One woman reportedly glowed faintly in the dark, not metaphorically but chemically. Still, the elite refused to give up their deadly couture. It was better to perish in perfect taste than to live looking plain. And so they did, all of them corseted, perfumed, and embalmed in their own wardrobe. In the end, the Victorian era proved one timeless truth: fashion kills. Sometimes it happens slowly, sometimes spectacularly, but it always happens with impeccable tailoring. Few inventions managed to capture the Victorian imagination quite like gaslight. It was modern, it was dazzling, and best of all, it was slightly explosive. When the first flickering flames illuminated the streets of London, people stood in awe, not realizing they were witnessing both the birth of progress and the quiet debut of indoor carbon monoxide therapy. Before gaslight came along, homes had to rely on candles and oil lamps, which at least had the decency to kill you slowly. But gaslighting, oh, that was pure efficiency. It burned cleaner, brighter, and it released just enough toxins into the air to make every single dinner party feel a bit like a seance. The middle class absolutely adored it. The working class installed it, and everyone at some point complained of a mysterious fatigue while turning a delicate shade of gray. The technology itself wasn't entirely reliable. Leaks were incredibly common, explosions were frequent, and half the city learned what methane smelled like the hard way. Some London homes lit up so suddenly that the occupants achieved enlightenment in the most literal sense, briefly and very violently. Still, gaslight was considered romantic. Lovers would meet beneath its golden haze, never noticing that it was gently corroding their lungs. Poets praised its soft glow, painters captured its warmth, and doctors quietly observed an entire city developing a collective anemia. Even servants fainting in unventilated kitchens were just dismissed as having delicate constitutions. Nothing ruins the mood quite like acknowledging that your home lighting also doubles as a slow-acting noose. The upper class, of course, didn't mind so much. They had bigger houses and much better ventilation, which simply meant their servants died first. For those on a tighter budget, economy lamps were marketed as being safe, though they occasionally filled the room with a dense vapor known affectionately as the death. When electric light finally arrived decades later, Victorians hesitated. Electricity was terrifying, dangerous, unpredictable, and quite possibly satanic. They decided to stick with gas instead, reasoning that it was the devil they knew. So yes, the gaslight was a miracle. It was a miracle that could illuminate your home, asphyxiate your guests, and detonate your kitchen, all in one convenient invention. It was modernity in its purest Victorian form, bright, beautiful, and fatally optimistic. In a century that was so obsessed with progress, nothing said, "Welcome home," quite like the faint hiss of a gas leak and the slow, invisible promise of unconsciousness. Of all the hazards that were lurking in the Victorian home, none was more committed to passive-aggressive murder than the wallpaper. It looked so harmless, floral, and tasteful, maybe just a bit too proud of itself. But behind all those dainty patterns lurked a compound that could take down an entire family faster than poor ventilation ever could. The culprit, of course, was arsenic, that loyal Victorian companion. The very same pigment that made fashion shimmer and paint glow was now slathered on walls from London to Leeds. It was widely considered a sign of refinement, proof that you were cultured, sophisticated, and just slightly luminous. If your parlor didn't look like a meadow in springtime, were you even considered civilized? The problem, naturally, was chemistry. In the damp houses of Britain, the moisture in the walls would react with the arsenic pigments, producing a fine dust and a gas called arsine, invisible, odorless, and charmingly lethal. Every fire that was lit, every curtain that was drawn, every sigh of admiration stirred even more poison into the air. Guests would often remark on the freshness of the room, and they were right. It was freshly killing them. Children were especially vulnerable, crawling around on arsenic-laced carpets, napping under arsenic drapes, and gnawing on arsenic-painted toys. Doctors called their mysterious illnesses summer sickness, which is Victorian for, "We have no idea what's going on, but let's go ahead and blame the weather." There were warning signs, of course. Servants who cleaned the wallpaper developed strange skin lesions. Factory workers in dye plants just dropped dead. One enterprising chemist scraped a little bit of green paper from his own wall, boiled it, inhaled the steam, and nearly joined his ancestors on the spot. His report was widely ignored because, well, the wallpaper really was rather pretty. Manufacturers denied everything. "It's perfectly safe," they insisted, "unless you eat it in large quantities," which was technically true but conveniently missed the part about breathing it in. When critics pushed back, they simply rebranded the arsenic colors as Paris green. Because if it sounds fancy enough, no one ever asks questions. So the papers stayed up, the curtains stayed drawn, and the guests kept complimenting the decor while slowly turning the same shade as the wallpaper. If hell had an interior designer, he would have been a Victorian, and his greatest masterpiece would have been the parlor wall, tasteful, floral, and coughing poison into the air at just the right rate to keep you fashionable right until the very end. The Victorians were a great many things, industrious, moralistic, and emotionally repressed, but above all else they were clean. Or rather, they were desperately trying to be. Dirt was no longer just something unpleasant, it was ungodly. A single speck of grime suggested a kind of moral decay, and a smudge on the silverware could completely damn your reputation faster than adultery ever could. So they cleaned endlessly, obsessively, and of course, fatally. When industrial chemists started to mass-produce cleaning products, Victorians embraced them with the kind of enthusiasm you see from people who have never read a warning label. Coal tar, phenol, ammonia. If it stung, burned, or dissolved something, it must be working. Housewives scrubbed until their hands looked like unfinished anatomy sketches. One particularly popular product, carbolic acid, was hailed as a miracle disinfectant. Hospitals used it, and so did homemakers. A few drops diluted in water could sterilize any surface, or blind you if you happened to splash it. It also had a pleasant smell, too, if you happened to enjoy the scent of antiseptic despair. Then there was chlorine bleach, which Victorians used as if they were trying to personally assassinate bacteria. When mixed with other common cleaners, it produced chlorine gas, the very same compound that was later weaponized in World War I, but that didn't stop anyone. If your kitchen didn't sting the eyes and burn the throat, it simply wasn't clean enough. Mercury soaps and ammonia polishes soon followed, giving homes the freshly embalmed aroma of progress. Housewives inhaled daily chemical cocktails that were strong enough to fumigate an entire opera house. The more it hurt, the better it felt. Pain, after all, was meant to signify purity, and Victorians loved nothing more than suffering with a moral purpose. Even the laundry was dangerous. Bluing agents, starches, and dyes often contained copper, lead, and arsenic, turning wash day into a low-grade chemistry experiment. Servants would frequently faint in the scalding steam rooms, then wake up only to do it all over again, because cleanliness was next to godliness, and apparently just beneath the morgue. Ironically, the cleaner the home, the sicker its inhabitants became. Chronic coughs, dermatitis, and headaches were all just chalked up to nerves. No one ever suspected the daily lungfuls of homemade poison. But to the Victorian mind, death by hygiene was an honorable way to go. Better to perish in a spotless kitchen than to live in filth with your dignity still intact. Progress smelled sharp, burned slightly, and came bottled with a cork and a skull on the label. In the Victorian home, smell was absolutely everything. An odor wasn't just unpleasant, it was considered immoral. To smell bad meant you were poor, uncultured, or possibly French. The well-bred home had to smell like virtue, even if that virtue came bottled in something that could strip paint right off the walls. So the Victorians perfumed everything they could. Soap, candles, clothing, hair. Even the air itself was forcibly improved. A proper lady could enter a room and leave behind a delicate fog of social superiority. Unfortunately, that fog also contained chloroform, alcohol, ether, and lead acetate. In short, she smelled divine right up until her kidneys decided to give up. Perfume making was a completely unregulated art form. Chemists simply mixed whatever smelled nice, or at least interesting, into alcohol and sold it as a luxury item. Some of these concoctions contained benzene or turpentine, both of which are excellent for cleaning machinery and destroying brain cells. Others included arsenic oils that gave a cooling sensation on the skin, which is also known as the first step toward necrosis. And it wasn't just the perfume. The Victorians scented their cleaning products, their starches, and even their gas lamps. When your home smells faintly of roses and burning coal, that's not refinement, that's a slow cremation. Then came violet powder, a cosmetic favorite that was made from orris root and chalk when it wasn't being made from ground glass. Women dusted it on their skin to achieve that ethereal, I'm dying but gracefully kind of glow. Many of them were in fact dying, but they looked absolutely fantastic doing it. Men weren't safe from this either. Gentlemen's hair tonics promised virility and shine, using ingredients like mercury nitrate and ether. The result was lustrous hair and mild hallucinations, which was perfect for surviving another dinner party about the empire and etiquette. The perfumed handkerchief was another absolute must-have, soaked in floral oils and occasionally chloroform for those who liked their fainting spells to be dramatic. Nothing said delicate constitution, quite like casually knocking yourself unconscious in public. In short, the Victorian home didn't just smell good, it smelled terminal. Every single whiff of lavender was a small act of chemical warfare. Every spritz of rose water was a health hazard cleverly disguised as luxury. Still, the advertisements insisted that these fragrances revived the spirit. They weren't exactly wrong. They just neglected to mention that the spirit in question might soon be leaving the body entirely. If the Victorian home was dangerous, then Victorian beauty was downright suicidal. The ideal woman of the time looked delicate, ethereal, and vaguely consumptive, like she might faint at any moment or perhaps pass away during dessert. The goal was to appear almost angelic. The method was industrial chemistry. Pale skin was the ultimate status symbol. It proved you weren't one of those tragic people who had to work outdoors and actually develop some color. So women turned to face powders that were made from lead carbonate and arsenic, which conveniently lightened the skin while also slowly destroying it. The results were stunning, at least until your teeth fell out. Manufacturers swore their products were dermatologically safe, which in the 19th century just meant that no one had died today. Women dusted their faces, necks, and shoulders on a daily basis with the enthusiasm of someone trying to become a ghost by sheer willpower. Some even applied vinegar of lead, a delightful mixture that literally burned the skin smooth, which was perfect if you wanted to look embalmed while you were still alive. And of course, there was rouge. No respectable woman would ever admit to using it, so everyone secretly did. It was made with mercury sulfide, and if it was applied too liberally, it caused tremors and mood swings. Nothing completes an evening look quite like a touch of mania and light mercury poisoning. Eye cosmetics were no better. To achieve that fashionable, doe-eyed look, women would drip belladonna, which literally means deadly nightshade, into their eyes to dilate their pupils. The result was gorgeous, glassy eyes and eventually blindness. But again, beauty required sacrifice. Perfumed arsenic wafers were even sold as complexion tablets. They promised to purify the skin from within, which they did by killing the user from within. The ads featured radiant women smiling beatifically, possibly because they had already lost all feeling in their faces. Even men weren't spared. Hair restorers promised to revive thinning locks with ingredients like lead acetate and silver nitrate, ensuring that while your hair darkened, your skull slowly developed neurological ambitions of its own. Victorian beauty, in short, was a competitive sport played against mortality, and mortality usually won. Every mirror reflected a masterpiece of self-inflicted suffering, polished to perfection and slowly disintegrating. Because in the 19th century, to look healthy, you first had to die trying. If hell had a catering department, it would have looked suspiciously like a Victorian kitchen. This was the very heart of the home, a place of warmth, nourishment, and the occasional spontaneous combustion. The Victorians loved efficiency, and their kitchens certainly proved it. Every meal was a chemical experiment, and every recipe was a gamble between dinner and the obituary column. The first problem was the fuel. Gas stoves were considered modern wonders, which is Victorian for guaranteed to explode at least once. Coal-fired ovens filled the room with soot, while open flames shared tight quarters with long skirts, wooden utensils, and an impressive lack of fire safety regulations. Housewives called it cooking. Fire brigades called it employment. The food itself wasn't much safer. Industrial progress had brought a whole host of new dyes, preservatives, and additives, none of which had passed anything remotely resembling a health inspection. Flour was whitened with alum, pickles were dyed with copper sulfate, and sweets were brightened with lead chromate. Children adored the vibrant colors, and parents adored the silence that followed. Milk was often diluted with chalk and water, giving it that lovely pastel hue and a much extended shelf life, for the bacteria at least. Bread, too, was frequently padded with plaster or bone dust to make it heavier. A good loaf of bread might contain more construction material than actual nutrition. Then there was the innovation in utensils. Cookware was commonly made of copper, tin, or lead, sometimes all three, just to keep things interesting. Acidic foods would leach metals directly into the meal, giving soups a pleasant tang of neurological decay. And since no one could taste the poison over the coal smoke anyway, dinner was served with confidence. Even the tea, that sacred elixir of the British soul, came through lead-glazed pots and sometimes contained bonus ingredients like iron filings for color. If you added a splash of milk with chalk and a cube of sugar with bone ash, you had yourself the full industrial revolution right there in a cup. Servants, of course, bore the brunt of all this. They inhaled smoke, scrubbed giant cauldrons, and handled enough poison to qualify as informal chemists. When they dropped dead, it was politely written off as kitchen fatigue. In short, the Victorian kitchen was less about nourishment and more about survival, a daily test of who could digest progress the longest. In theory, the arrival of indoor plumbing was one of the great triumphs of Victorian progress. In practice, it was like inviting the River Thames directly into your veins and just hopping for the best. For centuries, people had fetched their water from rivers, wells, or whatever puddle didn't already have livestock floating in it. The Victorians, determined to civilize the entire process, simply piped it indoors along with everything that was living in it. City water supplies were true miracles of engineering and also biological warfare. London's system drew its water from the Thames, which also happened to be the city's open sewer. Upstream, someone would dump their waste. Downstream, someone else would brew tea. It was a perfect model of social equality. Everyone got cholera, regardless of their class. Then there were the pipes, which were made of lead. They gleamed beautifully and leached steadily into the water. Every single sip was a microdose of heavy metal therapy. The Victorians found this perfectly acceptable since lead had been used since Roman times, and everyone knows the Romans turned out just fine. Water tanks were another adventure entirely. They were usually installed in attics, were rarely cleaned, and often shared their space with insects, birds, or the occasional dead rat. Servants were instructed to just skim the surface before serving the water. It was refreshing in a necro-romantic sort of way. To disguise the taste, people would boil the water using coal fires that filled the kitchen with soot, and then they'd add tea leaves, which at least made the poison politely British. Children, ever the optimists, were sometimes given water mixed with molasses to make it more pleasant. It wasn't. It was just sticky cholera. When cholera epidemics struck London in the mid-19th century, scientists argued over whether the disease came from bad air or bad morals. The idea that the water itself might be responsible was considered almost rude. After all, how could something so essential, so civilized, possibly betray them? Eventually, Dr. John Snow proved the connection by removing a pump handle and saving an entire neighborhood. The rest of the city took decades to finally believe him, because denial pairs beautifully with dysentery. So yes, Victorian water was a marvel, piped, pressurized, and fatal. It quenched thirst, spread disease, and slowly eroded the population, one polite glass at a time. At first glance, the Victorian bedroom looked peaceful, a true sanctuary of carved wood, lace curtains, and moral restraint. It was the one room where you could supposedly escape the noise of industrial life and just die quietly in your sleep. Comfort, after all, was just another word for a slightly toxic tranquility. The typical bed was a monument to craftsmanship and also respiratory illness. Mattresses were stuffed with horsehair, mildewed feathers, or whatever organic matter hadn't already developed its own ecosystem. Bed bugs thrived, dust mites held conventions, and the scent of damp decay was politely described as homely. For the well-to-do, luxury meant a mattress soaked in formaldehyde to prevent rot, and also to preserve the owner in case they didn't happen to wake up. Above it all hung the gas lamp, hissing faintly like a serpent. In the glow of its poisonous halo, couples would drift off to sleep while slowly asphyxiating. Poor ventilation ensured a perfect balance, just enough oxygen to dream, but not enough to make it to the morning. But at least the light was flattering. Everyone looks good under a thin film of carbon monoxide. Then there were the wallpapers, of course. Bedrooms often featured the softest tones of arsenic green, perfect for creating an atmosphere of calm nausea. The curtains matched, the carpets matched, and even the family cat matched briefly. Heating didn't help the situation. Coal fires filled the room with soot, and the flues were notorious for backdrafts. Some Victorians woke up coughing black dust. Others just didn't wake up at all. In the winter, people would stuff rags under the doors to keep out drafts, effectively trapping themselves in airtight mausoleums of domestic bliss. For the poor, the bedroom doubled as a kitchen, a nursery, and a morgue. Entire families would sleep together in one smoky chamber, with infants beside the fire, elders beside the fumes, and everyone taking turns breathing the same recycled air until someone eventually stopped. The Victorians were proud of their bedrooms. They called them places of rest and renewal. They were half right about that. Rest came swiftly. renewal was unlikely. So every night, the respectable citizen would climb into bed, draw the arsenic curtains, turn on the gaslight, and drift into that sweetest of all Victorian luxuries, a peaceful, fashionable, and perfectly unventilated death. In the Victorian imagination, childhood was a sacred time, a period of innocence, purity, and naturally toxic ingestion. Parents adored their little angels and proved it by surrounding them with objects that could maim, poison, or explode. Nothing said, "I love you," quite like a lead-painted rattle. Children's toys were true masterpieces of industrial optimism. Tin soldiers gleamed with lead paint, dolls blushed with mercury rouge, and rocking horses were varnished with arsenic lacquer to give them that healthy, deadly shine. Even teddy bears, those comforting companions of the nursery, were occasionally stuffed with sawdust, horsehair, or whatever the factory floor happened to offer that day. And the dolls, oh, the dolls. Their glass eyes were lovely, and their faces were perfectly pale thanks to a thin coating of lead-based enamel. Little girls would cuddle them to sleep while slowly inhaling microdoses of the Industrial Revolution. Boys weren't spared either. Their toy soldiers, painted in bright military colors, doubled as neurological experiments. Nothing builds character quite like a side of lead poisoning. Then came fireworks and chemistry sets, because what child doesn't need access to gunpowder before the age of 10? A particularly popular toy was the Victorian chemistry cabinet, which conveniently included arsenic, mercury, and potassium nitrate, the holy trinity of early cremation. Many a young gentleman learned about science by detonating his bedroom or melting a sibling's eyebrows. For teething infants, there were soothing syrups, harmless-looking bottles that actually contained morphine or laudanum. They promised quiet nights for both mother and child, and indeed they delivered, sometimes permanently. Opioid addiction began right there in the cradle, but at least everyone slept well. Even books, those paragons of Victorian morality, were dangerous. The cheap printing inks were made with antimony and copper, so bedtime stories came with a bonus lung irritant. Children would turn the pages of Little Women while slowly becoming little corpses. Parents didn't mean any harm, of course. They simply had faith in progress, and progress, it seems, had faith in arsenic. Childhood was meant to be tender, brief, and educational, and it often was in exactly that order. So the next time someone sighs about the good old days of simple Victorian play, just remember that the toys didn't just entertain the children, they outlived them. If you happened to catch something in the Victorian era, a fever, a cough, or just a mild existential crisis, the cure was simple. You took whatever was on the shelf and hoped for some divine intervention. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a veritable museum of controlled substances, none of which were actually controlled, and most of which were only technically medicinal. Doctors were quite creative back then. Every illness had a treatment, and every treatment had side effects that then required more treatment. Arsenic was used to stimulate the appetite. Mercury was prescribed for constipation. Cocaine was great for toothaches and for shyness. It was a time when you could cure just about anything, provided you didn't mind dying slightly faster. Pharmacies looked more like apothecary gambling dens. Their shelves were lined with glass bottles filled with glowing liquids and names that sounded poetic, until you actually read the ingredients. Laudanum, the reigning favorite, was a soothing mixture of alcohol and opium. It treated headaches, insomnia, and children who refused to take a nap. Mothers swore by it, and some mothers swore because of it. For colds, there was chloroform liniment. For indigestion, there were antimonial emetics. And for the vague condition known simply as nerves, there was morphine, conveniently sold as a soothing syrup. Doctors called this heroic medicine. Patients just called it quiet. Self-medication was practically a moral virtue. A good Victorian always kept a ready supply of patent remedies. Dr. Bateman's pectoral drops, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Carter's little liver pills, most of which were just industrial solvents with some clever branding. But the advertisements were absolutely delightful, featuring happy families, glowing cheeks, and absolutely no mention of kidney failure. Even spiritual leaders got involved. Some preachers swore by arsenic wafers to clear the complexion and elevate the soul. They weren't exactly wrong. It certainly elevated something. It wasn't all ignorance, though. There was faith, too. A faith that a tonic could cure melancholy, that a syrup could soothe loss, that a pill could make life bearable in an age where everything from your wallpaper to your water was quietly trying to kill you. The Victorian medicine cabinet wasn't really a source of healing. It was more of a polite suicide note written in cursive on glass bottles. And yet, they took their doses faithfully, not because they trusted the medicine, but because they trusted manners. After all, nothing said grace under pressure, quite like overdosing elegantly. Behind every single immaculate Victorian household, there was a small army of servants, invisible, obedient, and quietly dying. The mistress of the house might boast of her spotless floors and polished silver, but it was the servants who achieved that perfection by inhaling it. The average middle-class home employed at least one maid, and often several if the family was ambitious. They scrubbed the arsenic walls, polished the mercury furniture, and boiled the laundry in bleach that was strong enough to erase fingerprints and also lungs. When the mistress said the house looked divine, she wasn't wrong. Half of her staff was already halfway there. The scullery maid worked in a permanent steam bath of lye, carbolic acid, and despair, her hands never stopping their burning sensation. The laundry maid stirred giant cauldrons of chemical soup, sometimes fainting from the fumes, and sometimes actually falling in. The chimney boy spent his youth inhaling soot until his lungs resembled the very hearths he was paid to clean. And the cook, that proud general of the kitchen, faced coal smoke, boiling grease, and exploding stoves with the kind of resignation of someone who understood natural selection on an intimate level. Servants slept in cramped attic rooms directly beneath the gas pipes, which would occasionally leak because irony was always punctual in the 19th century. They rose before dawn, coughed their way through their chores, and usually died before they reached the age of 40. The family would cluck sympathetically about it, and then simply hire another one. She had a weak constitution, they'd say, ignoring the fact that her constitution had been methodically dissolved by ammonia. The upstairs family, meanwhile, prided itself on its moral superiority. They would give sermons about temperance while their staff inhaled gin vapors from the cleaning solvents. They quoted scripture on humility while paying wages that could barely cover the cost of a coffin. The Victorians believed that service built character. They just never specified whose character it was building. Servants were the machinery that made middle-class virtue possible, disposable, replaceable, and perfectly silent. When one of them fell ill, another would take her place, as if the house itself demanded a fresh sacrifice in order to remain spotless. And yet, despite all the misery, many of them stayed. Where else was there to go? The factories were worse and the streets were final. At least here, beneath the gaslight and the arsenic wallpaper, death came with 3 meals a day and the faint comfort of dying in a uniform. If hell had manners, it would have been a Victorian home. Every single hallway whispered of refinement, every object gleamed with progress, and nearly everything inside could kill you before supper. It wasn't chaos, it was a curated catastrophe. The great irony of the 19th century is that it wanted so badly to be clean, civilized, and eternal, and in the process, it managed to invent indoor chemical warfare. There was arsenic on the walls, lead in the pipes, mercury in the powder, and morphine in the nursery. Death didn't come knocking on the door, it was already on the guest list. Yet no one really saw it that way. The Victorians absolutely adored their homes. They were proud of them, every single poisonous inch. A perfect parlor was proof of one's moral superiority, and if that parlor occasionally emitted a faint, choking vapor, well, one must suffer for the sake of taste. Guests might faint mid-conversation, but fainting was considered fashionable. There was a grim kind of optimism to it all, that distinctive Victorian faith in progress, even when that progress came with lesions. A society that could turn rat poison into wall art and chloroform into perfume truly believed it was unstoppable. And in a way it was. Nothing could stop it except perhaps its own plumbing. The modern age they dreamed of did arrive eventually, cleaner, safer, and brighter. But it came built on a century of corpses who died elegantly at home, surrounded by matching curtains. When the last gaslight was replaced by electricity and arsenic wallpaper quietly disappeared from the catalogs, no one ever issued an apology. They simply redecorated. We like to imagine them as naive, but perhaps they weren't. Perhaps the Victorians knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that the same drive to purify, to perfect, and to progress is always just a prettier name for destruction. Maybe they understood that beauty kills, that comfort corrupts, and that no civilization ever dies ugly. And so, the great domestic apocalypse went completely unnoticed. There were no wars, no riots, just a quiet, genteel extinction happening behind lace curtains. The empire may have ruled the world, but it couldn't conquer its own living room. In the end, the Victorian home wasn't just a house. It was a slow-motion obituary with great interior design. In Sparta, hair was never just hair. It was a declaration. The Spartan's long mane wasn't about fashion or some kind of personal style. It was a living symbol of pride, of freedom, and of defiance. When most other Greek men were trimming their hair short to project an image of discipline, Spartans let theirs grow wild and long, believing that beauty itself was a reflection of strength. A man's hair was his personal battle flag, flowing behind him as he charged into the enemy lines, glinting in the sunlight like a crimson-tinted halo of courage. From a very young age, Spartan boys were taught that grooming was not an act of vanity, but an act of discipline. The Agoge, their brutal state-run education system, drilled this idea into every single recruit. Before a battle, warriors would brush and braid their hair, sometimes coating it with olive oil to make it shine. This ritual wasn't just about their appearance, it was a preparation for death. To a Spartan, dying beautifully was the same as dying with honor. If they were to fall on the battlefield, their hair would frame their face with dignity, and their body would be remembered not as a corpse, but as an image of heroism. The act of grooming before combat absolutely shocked outsiders. To the Athenians and other Greeks, it seemed strange, even arrogant. But for the Spartans, it was sacred. Plutarch once wrote that they paid the most attention to their hair when they were about to enter into danger because they wished to appear noble in the face of death. This wasn't arrogance, it was a performance of courage. When you looked good while facing death, fear simply lost its power. Even the defeated enemy would remember the sight. A wall of long-haired men shining in bronze armor, each one ready to meet his end without flinching. Their hair became their legend. Mothers and wives in Sparta would brush and braid the hair of their sons and husbands before they left for war, sometimes whispering the words, "Return with your shield," or "on it." Long hair was never permitted for slaves or for cowards. It was something reserved for the free, for those who had proven themselves worthy in battle. In a world that was built on endurance, on silence, and on blood, a Spartan's hair was his final statement, a reminder that beauty and death were not opposites, but allies. The Spartan approach to grooming was forged in the fires of the Agoge, the infamous training system that shaped young boys into living weapons. From the age of 7, every male child was taken from his mother's arms and handed over to the state to be stripped of all comfort, taught to endure pain, and molded into a warrior. Yet amid all the brutality, the starvation, the whippings, the endless drills, one lesson stood out above the rest. Discipline extended even to one's appearance. While other Greek city-states saw grooming as something feminine or indulgent, the Spartans viewed it as a matter of order. A soldier who could keep his body clean and his hair neat after a long day of mud, sweat, and combat was one who had truly mastered himself. It was said that the state's instructors would inspect not only the boys' posture and their weapons, but also their nails, their cloaks, and their hair. Dirt and disorder were considered signs of weakness, and in Sparta, weakness was a disease. The Agoge taught that a warrior's worth was measured not only by his sword, but also by his composure. A man who looked disheveled before his peers was thought to lack inner strength. After all, the enemy should never see you broken, not even in the smallest detail. A true Spartan could suffer hunger, loss, or pain, and still manage to appear immaculate. The discipline of grooming was the outward reflection of inward control. Each morning, the boys would wash in cold water, comb their hair, and polish their weapons, a trifecta of perfect order. Their mentors used these small rituals to build a sense of rhythm and resilience within them. They were told, if you cannot master your hair, you cannot master yourself. The message was crystal clear. Discipline in small things prepares you for greatness in the large ones. By the time these boys became men, the routine was second nature. Before going to war, they would bathe, oil their skin, and comb their long hair, even when death was waiting for them on the horizon. To them, there was no contradiction between savagery and elegance. Cleanliness, posture, and poise were weapons of their own. And so the lessons of the Agoge lingered on. That beauty was not a luxury, but a form of armor, a visible testament to Spartan order, even amid the chaos of war. Before every great battle, when the air grew heavy with the scent of bronze and fear, the Spartans would perform a ritual that baffled their enemies. As the rest of Greece was sharpening swords and tightening their armor straps, the warriors of Laconia reached for their combs. They sat calmly by the campfires, oiling and braiding their long hair, with each movement being deliberate, unhurried, almost sacred. This was not an act of vanity. It was an act of ritual defiance. To prepare one's hair before stepping into the jaws of death was the ultimate expression of Spartan courage. It told the world, we do not rush toward fate, we meet it on our own terms. When Persian scouts spied on Leonidas's 300 men at Thermopylae, they were reportedly astonished to find them combing their hair and polishing their shields instead of bracing for the coming slaughter. To the Persians, it looked like sheer madness. To the Spartans, it was dignity. The ritual served a dual purpose, both psychological and spiritual. The act of grooming calmed the nerves and focused the mind. In the same way that a priest prepares for a sacred rite, the Spartan prepared for battle, not through panic or frenzy, but through ritual order. Combing the hair, oiling the skin, and tightening the cloak were all acts of grounding, reminders of one's humanity before the chaos of war stripped it all away. There was also a deep sense of solidarity in this. Warriors would groom one another, inspecting braids, helping to tie back locks, and making sure that every man looked both fierce and honorable. This shared ritual turned an army into a true brotherhood. When the time finally came to face death, they would not march as individuals, but as a single, disciplined body, with each man as composed as the next. To die unkempt was considered shameful. To die with your hair neatly arranged was to die as a Spartan, clean, composed, and unforgettable. Even after the battle, when their lifeless bodies were retrieved, the sight of their orderly hair and polished armor was a haunting reminder. These men were prepared not just to fight, but also to be remembered. In Sparta, the preparation for death was never a grim affair. It was graceful. The brush, the oil, the braid, these were not tools of vanity, but instruments of immortality. Spartan women were just as proud of their hair as their men were, and perhaps their grooming was even more symbolic. In a society where women trained, owned land, and commanded a level of respect unlike anywhere else in Greece, their appearance was not a matter of seduction, but a declaration of their power. The long hair of a Spartan woman was her crown, a mark of vitality, discipline, and her noble bloodline. While Athenian women would cover their hair modestly, Spartan women wore theirs loose, free, and visible for all to see. To outsiders, this seemed scandalous, too bold, too confident. But to the Spartans, it reflected the same freedom and dignity that their men embodied in battle. They believed that beauty and strength were inseparable virtues. A well-kept appearance was thought to signify inner balance, just as a strong body reflected a disciplined spirit. When a woman married, tradition required her to cut her hair short, a symbolic act that represented her transition from a maiden to a wife. Her hair would then grow long again as she settled into her new role, reflecting her status as a matron, the very backbone of Spartan society. It was a ritual that mirrored the cycles of battle and peace, cutting away innocence and regrowing wisdom. Women played an intimate role in the grooming of warriors, too. Before their husbands or sons went off to war, they would comb and braid their hair, whispering blessings of courage. This act was deeply emotional, part affection and part preparation for death. Every strand they straightened might be the last one they would ever touch. Yet, Spartan women did not cry. They took pride in this ritual. To weep before a battle was a sign of weakness. To send a well-groomed son to war was an honor. Their famous saying, "Return with your shield or on it," carried the very same spirit. Beauty, discipline, and death were intertwined threads in the Spartan worldview. For women, maintaining their own hair was an act of resistance against despair. For men, allowing their hair to be tended was an acknowledgement of love and duty. In a land where both genders lived for the state, grooming was not a luxury, it was a patriotic duty. The luster of their hair was said to reflect the health of Sparta itself, and in every braid, in every polished strand, lived the echo of that relentless ideal: to be beautiful, even in the shadow of death. In Sparta, hair carried meanings that ran far deeper than just aesthetics. It was a living code, a visual language of identity, freedom, and courage. The long hair of a Spartan warrior proclaimed him to be a free man, one who had completed the brutal education of the agoge and had earned the right to call himself a citizen soldier. Only the enslaved and the cowardly wore their hair short. To cut it without cause was to completely renounce one's honor. Freedom in the Spartan sense was never about doing as one pleased. It was about the right to embody dignity. The flowing hair of a Spartan was not an act of wild rebellion. It was an act of disciplined defiance. It symbolized mastery over the self and therefore mastery over fear. A warrior's hair shining in the sun reminded both friend and foe that the man beneath it feared neither a blade nor death. It was said that, when Spartan armies marched, their hair moved like a sea of dark fire, a spectacle so imposing that it often broke the enemy's courage before the first spear was even thrown. Hair also marked the transitions in life. Boys would shave their heads when they entered the agoge, a symbolic shedding of their childhood. When they finally graduated into manhood, they let it grow long again, signifying the return of freedom through earned discipline. Every inch of that hair told a story of endurance, of scars, of loyalty to Sparta. But the symbolism went beyond life itself. After a warrior fell in battle, his comrades would comb his hair one final time before burning or burying him. It was an act of deep reverence, ensuring that he entered the afterlife not as a mangled corpse, but as a hero whose appearance perfectly reflected his spirit. His hair, still immaculate, testified that he had met death with grace. Even prisoners of war, when shorn of their hair by their captors, understood the humiliation. To be stripped of one's locks was to be stripped of one's very identity as a Spartan. Long hair was the last luxury of freedom, the banner of the living. And when it fluttered over the blood-soaked fields of Thermopylae or Plataea, it was more than just an ornament. It was a symbol of what no conqueror could ever take, the Spartan soul, unbroken, unbowed, and unforgettable. Though Spartan life was defined by austerity, grooming held a special, almost ceremonial place within the city-state's daily rhythm. Unlike in Athens or Corinth, Sparta had no bustling marketplaces filled with perfumed barbers boasting of exotic oils. Yet even here, barbers did exist, and they were treated with a peculiar kind of respect. Their task was not mere trimming or styling, but the maintenance of discipline itself. The Spartan barber's chair was less of a luxury and more of a seat of honor. Men of the same regiment would often visit together, not for idle chatter, but to maintain the unity of their appearance. The barber's tools were simple, combs, blades, and jars of olive oil, but the atmosphere was solemn. To have one's hair tended to was not a moment of leisure. It was an affirmation that even in times of peace, a warrior's body must remain ready. Young recruits, freshly graduated from the agoge, would often have their first full grooming done publicly. It was a mark of transition, a visual confirmation that they had endured every trial and were now among the ranks of men. Elders might watch in silence, approving the neatness of the cut, the symmetry of the braid. Beauty was never left to chance in Sparta. It was engineered through ritual precision. Women, too, engaged in collective grooming. On certain festivals, Spartan maidens would braid one another's hair in long, flowing patterns, sometimes weaving in small ribbons of crimson or bronze to symbolize vitality and lineage. These gatherings were not about idle vanity. They were performances of unity, reflections of Sparta's ideal that harmony between individuals strengthened the state as a whole. What separated Spartan grooming from that of other Greek cities was its public nature. No one hid behind curtains or in private courtyards. Grooming was communal, visible, and deliberate, a social act that reinforced hierarchy and order. Even kings took part, sitting beside common soldiers before great campaigns, allowing barbers or comrades to comb their hair before addressing the troops. It was through these shared rituals that the city maintained its cohesion. Every single stroke of the comb, every twist of the braid, every glint of olive oil was a small reminder of a greater truth, that in Sparta, beauty was discipline made visible, and grooming was a civic duty as sacred as warfare itself. In a culture where fear was considered an act of treason, appearance became a form of psychology. The Spartans understood that morale, both their own and their enemies, could be shaped not only by words and weapons, but by the way they presented themselves. Hair, gleaming and untamed, was their first line of psychological warfare. Before a battle, when the enemy was still waiting beyond the field, the Spartans took their time. They combed their hair, oiled their bodies, and straightened their crimson cloaks. The purpose was perfectly clear: serenity in the face of death. To any observer, this calmness looked supernatural, almost divine. The Persians at Thermopylae thought Leonidas's men were mad, but the Spartans wanted them to think that. A warrior who can calmly fix his hair before dying is one who has already conquered fear, and that display alone could weaken the enemy's will. Historians later wrote that even the most disciplined foes would hesitate before charging men who looked so ready to die beautifully. It was psychological intimidation disguised as pure elegance. Clean hair became a weapon, a visible sign of confidence that infected the entire battlefield. But the ritual did more than just frighten others. It fortified the Spartans themselves. The combing, the oiling, the tightening of the braid became an act of meditation. Each motion reminded them of their upbringing, their oaths, and their ancestors. It grounded them. The warrior who focused on his grooming was, in truth, preparing his spirit for what was to come. To go into battle disheveled would be to go in unprepared, both in body and in mind. Even after a battle, the survivors continued the ritual of grooming. They would wash their hair in cold water, clean the dust and blood from their scalps, and comb through the tangles of war. It was an act of recovery, both physical and spiritual. To cleanse oneself was to honor the fallen and to remind the living that discipline must endure, even after chaos. In this way, the Spartan ideal of grooming became a mirror of their inner philosophy, that true strength lies not in rage but in composure, not in frenzy but in control. Every polished strand of hair reflected that core belief, that a warrior's beauty was not vanity but a victory over fear itself. For Spartans, grooming did not end with life. It extended into death, the last ritual before eternity. When a warrior fell on the battlefield, his comrades treated his body not as a casualty, but as a relic of honor. The first act was always the same: to straighten his cloak, polish his armor, and comb his hair one final time. This final grooming was more than just a gesture of respect. It was a sacred duty. A disheveled corpse was seen as an insult to the gods and to Sparta itself. The fallen deserved to be remembered not in disarray, but in beauty, the kind of beauty that testified to courage, control, and a readiness for death. Even after blood and dust had claimed their faces, the Spartans made sure that the last thing the world saw was dignity. The mothers who had sent these men to war understood this intimately. When word of a death returned to Sparta, they did not wail or tear their hair as other Greek women did. Instead, they would comb and braid their own hair, a silent act of acceptance. The ritual was cyclical. The same hands that had prepared a son for battle now prepared themselves for mourning. Yet even their mourning was neat, measured, and disciplined. It was said that before a great burial, the women of the city would gather to oil the hair of the deceased, their movements synchronized, rhythmic, almost like a prayer. The act was intimate but also impersonal, for in Sparta, death belonged not to families but to the state. Every braid they tied was a promise that the fallen would be remembered in order, not in chaos. The graves of the warriors were simple, marked only with their names and the phrase for Sparta. But their memory lived on vividly through the image they left behind. Hair braided, faces serene, armor gleaming in the afterglow of sacrifice. The ritual ensured that even in death, the Spartan remained whole. In a world that was so obsessed with survival, the Spartans taught that how one looked in death mattered just as much as how one lived. The final combing was a farewell not of sorrow, but of reverence, the last act of defiance against decay, and a reminder that beauty, like valor, could transcend the grave. Centuries have passed since Sparta's walls crumbled and its phalanxes faded into legend. Yet the image of the long-haired Spartan endures, timeless, unyielding, and immortal. Ancient writers, artists, and philosophers never forgot that peculiar blend of savagery and grace. The hair, so meticulously cared for before battle, became the symbol of everything the Spartans represented: courage, control, and the refusal to be conquered by fear or disorder. When later Greek cities looked back on Sparta, they saw more than just soldiers. They saw an ideal. Even Rome, a civilization built on discipline and conquest, borrowed fragments of the Spartan identity. Roman soldiers oiled their hair, groomed themselves before inspection, and admired the laconic virtue of neatness in the midst of chaos. The Spartans had taught the world that appearance is the mirror of the soul, that order in the body reveals order in the mind. The rituals survived in subtle ways throughout history. Armies continued the habit of cleaning, shaving, or arranging themselves before combat. Napoleon's troops polished their boots before facing cannon fire. Japanese samurai brushed their hair before committing seppuku. Modern soldiers still check their uniforms before stepping into the unknown. Each of these acts carries the same unspoken philosophy: dignity and discipline, beauty and bravery. For historians, the Spartan obsession with grooming offers a glimpse into their psychology. They were not vain men. They were deliberate ones. In a society where the line between life and death was incredibly thin, they found meaning in control. To master one's hair was to master chaos itself. That's why their long locks became such a potent emblem, a visible reminder that the human spirit, when properly trained, could remain composed even while facing annihilation. Today, the Spartan look lives on in art, film, and our collective imagination. The calm warrior, hair flowing behind a polished helmet, eyes fixed forward. It is a myth that is reborn endlessly, from ancient marble to Hollywood screens. Yet beneath the armor and the legend lies something simpler and more profound: the belief that discipline can make even death beautiful. The legacy of Spartan grooming endures not because of vanity, but because it speaks to something eternal. In every age, those who face their battles, whether literal or metaphorical, understand what the Spartans once knew: that order, pride, and composure are the final luxuries of the truly free. Before the philosophers gathered to argue about virtue and geometry, and before the sculptors picked up their chisels, Athens awoke to the smell of food. As the first rays of sunlight struck the marble columns of the agora, the hum of trade began, not with politics, but with breakfast. Vendors, fishermen, bakers, and farmers all converged on the city's beating heart, transforming it into a festival of smoke, chatter, and aroma. Carts rattled across the stones as merchants set up their makeshift stalls. Clay braziers hissed to life, fueled by olive wood and charcoal. The air quickly filled with the scent of sesame, honey, and grilled fish, a perfume so familiar that even the stray dogs lingered as if they were hypnotized. The agora, part marketplace and part theater, was where Athenians tasted life itself. Food was the great equalizer. The philosopher and the potter might argue endlessly about the meaning of the good life, but they both began their mornings in the exact same way, with a bite of something cheap, warm, and quick. Street food in ancient Greece was the true forerunner of modern fast food, affordable, fast, and packed with flavor. Vendors would shout over each other, each one trying to draw a crowd with their practiced voices. Honey cakes, roasted chickpeas, fresh olives from the Peloponnese. Most of these delicacies were simple but absolutely divine. You could buy barley cakes drizzled with honey, still warm from the coals. Chickpeas were roasted until they were crisp and then salted by hand. Olive sellers carried baskets lined with leaves to keep their wares cool, while a few daring cooks grilled tiny fish on skewers, their skin sizzling in hot oil. For just a few obols, small copper coins, you could fill your stomach and walk away full enough to face the day's work or the day's debate. Around the food stalls, the Agora truly came alive. Merchants haggled over prices, children darted between tables clutching sesame pastries, and stray cats prowled for any scraps they could find. The clatter of pottery and the hiss of oil competed with laughter and gossip. It was here that daily life truly began. Long before fast food ever became a term, Athens had already perfected it. It was food meant not for feasts or banquets, but for the streets, eaten with one hand, enjoyed among strangers, and flavored with the dust of a city that never stopped talking. If Athens had a particular smell, it was the smell of bread and olives. These were the city's most democratic foods, eaten by philosophers, slaves, soldiers, and statesmen alike. For many, this humble pairing wasn't just a snack. It was a matter of survival. A loaf of barley bread, coarse and dense, paired with a handful of salted olives, could sustain a worker through an entire day of labor beneath the hot Mediterranean sun. Bread was the very backbone of Greek street food. Bakers would rise before dawn, kneading dough made from barley, wheat, or spelt, depending on one's means. Barley was the grain of the poor, while wheat was the luxury of the rich. The smell of fresh loaves would carry through the narrow alleys, drawing hungry Athenians toward the Agora long before the market even officially opened. Vendors sold bread from wooden trays or carts, slicing it into chunks for dipping into olive oil or honey. The olives, meanwhile, came from the very soul of Greece itself. Cultivated for thousands of years, they were more than just food. They were a symbol of peace, fertility, and victory. Athenian vendors would soak them in brine, flavor them with herbs, or stuff them with garlic or figs. For a few coins, a worker could buy a small paper cone filled with olives, their oil staining the wrapper, the ancient equivalent of street fries. Sometimes the two were combined into something simple yet divine. A piece of bread rubbed with garlic, splashed with oil, and topped with crushed olives, eaten with the fingers, warm and dripping. To this, some might add a slice of goat cheese or a sprinkling of thyme if they could afford the luxury. The poorer citizens of Athens often carried small clay jars of olive oil at their belts, using it for both food and hygiene. When hunger struck, they would simply tear off a piece of bread, dip it in the oil, and chew slowly, letting it soften the dryness of the grain. There was a kind of poetry in that simplicity. There were no sauces, no excess, just what the earth gave. Bread for strength and olives for spirit. Together they formed the poor man's feast, sustaining both the body and one's pride. In a city so obsessed with ideas, even the simplest meal carried a touch of philosophy. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive, everything perfectly balanced. Among the clamor of the Athenian Agora, one sound often rose above the rest: the cheerful calls of the honey cake vendors. Their stalls were constantly surrounded by children clutching coins, soldiers returning from their training, and philosophers sneaking in a guilty pleasure before resuming their debates. The sweet scent of warm honey drifting through the air was simply impossible to resist. Honey was the dessert of the gods, and the Greeks treated it as such. It sweetened their sacrifices, perfumed their wine, and turned even the most basic grain into a true delight. The most famous of all the street sweets was the *melitauta*, small, round cakes made from flour and cheese, deep-fried in olive oil, and then drenched in thick, golden honey. Vendors would display them on bronze trays, their surfaces glistening in the sunlight like coins from Olympus. These cakes were a luxury that even the poor could occasionally afford. A small honey cake cost just a few obols, and the taste was said to bring comfort on even the hardest of days. In the heat of the market, people would tear them apart with their fingers, letting the syrup stick to their skin before licking it away. For a few moments, even a slave could taste something divine. The vendors themselves were characters as vibrant as their goods. They wore aprons stained with flour and honey, shouting their offers like poets performing verses. Hot cakes, sweet as Aphrodite's kiss. One bite and you'll forget your debts. Their humor and their showmanship were all part of the sale. The best sellers weren't just cooks, they were performers of pleasure. Honey itself was considered sacred. It was said to be a gift from the nymphs, and the bees were thought to be servants of the gods. To eat honey was to taste immortality, and in every sticky bite of a street pastry, Athenians felt a touch of the divine world they worshipped. Sometimes before festivals or plays, crowds would line up for honey cakes, their laughter and chatter mixing with the hum of flutes and the smell of roasted nuts. It was a communal indulgence, a moment of sweetness in a city that was built on struggle, trade, and talk. In ancient Athens, even pleasure was portable, served hot, golden, and wrapped in the hum of the streets. Not every Athenian could afford honey cakes or grilled fish. For the majority, the workers, the sailors, and the slaves, chickpeas and lentils were the taste of daily life. Humble, nourishing, and incredibly cheap, they were sold on every street corner by men with small bronze pots balanced over hot coals. The aroma would drift through the marketplace like a promise of warmth. Roasted chickpeas were the original Greek snack, crunchy, salty, and addictively simple. Vendors would scoop them straight from the pans with wooden ladles into small clay bowls or even folded leaves, shouting, "Hot chickpeas for the strong and the wise." Children would clutch them by the handful, chewing as they followed their parents through the bustling agora. For soldiers and travelers, these little legumes were the perfect food. They lasted for weeks, they filled the stomach, and they cost next to nothing. At the other end of the market, a different scent filled the air, that of lentil stew, simmering slowly in large clay pots. It was called *fakes, and it was the most democratic dish in all of Greece. From beggars to philosophers, everyone ate it. Socrates himself was said to have favored lentil soup, calling it the meal of the contented man. Thickened with olive oil, onion, and a bit of vinegar, it was both simple and sustaining, the kind of food that reminded Athenians that even the humblest meal could be noble when it was shared. To the poor citizens, lentil stew wasn't just food, it was comfort. Vendors would ladle it, still steaming, into small bowls for customers to eat right on the spot. Workers would eat it sitting on stone steps, dipping stale bread into the thick broth and wiping their mouths with the backs of their hands. The stew's earthy aroma mingled with the sounds of the marketplace, the ringing of coins, the cries of merchants, the bleating of goats. Occasionally, wealthier Athenians would add garlic, herbs, or even bits of sausage to elevate the dish. But for most, the pure flavor of the lentils was enough. It tasted of survival, of home, of life continuing on despite any hardship. In the bustling agora, chickpeas popped in their pans, lentils bubbled over coals, and the scent of oil and earth filled the air. This was the food of the people, simple, enduring, and unmistakably Greek, a quiet counterpoint to the city's constant noise and glory. By midday, the agora would fill with the unmistakable smell of the sea. The fishermen had arrived, rough men with salt in their hair and voices like gravel, pushing carts heavy with the morning's catch. Their arrival transformed the marketplace into a seaside feast. The sizzling of grilled fish joined the chorus of merchants, philosophers, and gossip. Fish was Athens's favorite luxury and also its most common comfort food. The poor would buy sardines, anchovies, or sprats, small, bony fish that were grilled whole on skewers. The wealthy might choose a red mullet or a sea bream, their flesh tender and glistening with oil. But whether you were a beggar or a general, the ritual was always the same. Grill it, salt it, drizzle it with lemon, and eat it while it was still steaming. The vendors worked quickly. They would light small fires beneath clay grates, brushing the fish with olive oil and herbs. Smoke rose in soft white ribbons, carrying the scent throughout the agora, and passers-by just couldn't resist. Even philosophers would pause mid-debate, drawn toward the promise of charred skin and salt. The vendors sprinkled the fish with oregano, thyme, or crushed coriander, their movements swift and practiced. Some customers ate standing up, tearing the fish apart with their fingers, while others wrapped their portions in grape leaves to carry along the dusty streets. The bones were simply discarded into the gutters, where cats and stray dogs feasted in their own way. The agora was noisy, smoky, alive, and always hungry. Beyond Athens, in port towns like Piraeus, the fish stalls were even more vibrant. There, sailors drank watered-down wine and ate skewers of grilled squid or octopus, their laughter echoing across the docks. For them, seafood wasn't just nourishment. It was a connection to Poseidon himself, a divine gift from the sea that sustained both commerce and appetite. Even the smell became a part of daily life. The smoke from the fish clung to tunics, hair, and hands, the scent of Athens itself, as familiar as olive oil or dust. And though many mocked the city's obsession with seafood, none could deny that it was the very heartbeat of its streets. In every grilled sardine and every slice of red mullet, Athens tasted both its labor and its leisure, proof that even the simplest flame could turn the day's catch into something divine. No Athenian meal, whether for the rich or the poor, was ever complete without a drink. But contrary to our modern imagination, no one in Greece drank wine straight from the jug. That would have been considered barbaric. Instead, wine was always mixed with water, sometimes flavored with herbs or honey, creating a light, refreshing drink that could be enjoyed even in the blazing afternoon sun. The street taverns, or keiplea, were the lifeblood of Athens after midday. They weren't grand dining halls, but small, open-air stalls, usually shaded by simple linen awnings. A few wooden benches, some clay cups, and a jug of wine were all that was needed to turn a corner of the agora into a gathering place. Vendors poured crassy or diluted wine from amphorae into small clay cups, while the air buzzed with laughter, debate, and the scrape of sandals on stone. These taverns were not places of refinement, but of conversation. Merchants would argue about trade, sailors would boast about storms they had survived, and philosophers, naturally, would debate about moderation while rarely practicing it themselves. The drink itself was a mix of art and practicality. If it was too strong, it clouded the mind, too weak, and it dulled the spirit. The Greeks prized balance even in their cups. Alongside the wine came snacks, salty olives, roasted nuts, and small pieces of fried dough dusted with herbs. These simple bites were designed to keep one's wits sharp while also prolonging the drinking. Some taverns offered oinomly a wine sweetened with honey, to those who could afford a sweeter indulgence. Others poured wine spiced with cinnamon or anise, giving the marketplace a faint, perfumed warmth. There was also a clear social rhythm to the drinking. In the early hours, men drank quickly before returning to their work. By evening, the taverns became much livelier, filled with song, dice games, and the distant hum of flutes. Drunkenness was frowned upon in Athens, but merriment was always encouraged. To drink was not to escape life, but to celebrate its order, to toast the gods, the harvest, or simply surviving another day. As dusk fell and the last craters were emptied, the taverns would dim and the city would quiet down. Yet the scent of wine and honey lingered in the air, the perfume of a people who found philosophy even in their thirst. If you followed your nose through the Athenian agora, past the fish smoke and the honeyed pastries, you would eventually find the spice sellers, the quiet magicians of the street. Their stalls were smaller than most, yet their presence was unmistakable. The air around them shimmered with the perfume of pepper, coriander, cumin, and saffron. Long before the word exotic even existed, Athens already smelled like the world. Spices were the crossroads of trade and taste. Ships from Egypt, Phoenicia, and Persia brought strange powders and dried herbs in clay jars sealed with wax. These treasures weren't just for the wealthy. Even the humblest street vendor would sprinkle cumin or oregano onto bread, lentils, or grilled meat to give it some character. For an extra coin, one spice seller would boast, you can buy your meal seasoned like a lord's. Their stalls were displays of color and mystery. Mounds of crimson saffron, pale yellow mustard, and deep green thyme filled their counters. Some vendors would burn bay leaves or myrrh in small censers to attract customers, letting the fragrant smoke curl above their heads. The smell of roasting chickpeas mingled with the spice smoke, creating a sensory fog that hung over the marketplace like incense in a temple. Spices were not just about flavor, they carried meaning. Cumin was thought to symbolize greed, while coriander was a sign of vitality. Saffron was luxury itself, used in perfumes, robes, and desserts. To eat something spiced with saffron was to taste wealth, if only for a brief moment. Even garlic and onion, the humblest of ingredients, were prized for their boldness, a sign of strength, much like the Spartans who devoured them before battle. For many Athenians, Spices transformed daily food into a true experience. A simple bowl of lentils could become aromatic and rich, and a piece of fried fish could become divine. The best vendors developed reputations that rivaled those of the philosophers, one known for his Egyptian cinnamon, another for his secret blend of herbs that was said to be good for love and courage. The Agora's symphony of smells was just as vital as its sounds. The crackle of oil, the hiss of smoke, the laughter of the crowds, all of it was threaded together by scent. In every single grain of spice lay a whisper of faraway lands, proof that even in ancient times, Athens tasted the world, one breath at a time. On festival days, the streets of Athens would become a living feast. The Agora, already lively on ordinary mornings, would explode into a carnival of food, music, and celebration. Vendors from every corner of Attica would flood the city, their carts piled high with ingredients meant to please both mortals and gods. Smoke curled above the rooftops, mingling with the sound of flutes and laughter as Athenians forgot their troubles and surrendered completely to their appetite. During the Panathenaic festival, which honored the goddess Athena herself, even the poorest citizens could indulge. Farmers would offer their best olives, fishermen grilled eels from Lake Capys, and bakers competed to produce the fluffiest honey bread. The air shimmered with heat and the smell of sesame oil. Priests would perform sacrifices at dawn, and by midday the streets had become dining halls without walls. Tables groaned with roasted goat, barley porridge, cheese, figs, and freshly baked flatbread. Everyone, citizens, medics, and slaves, shared in the bounty. Street food took on a special role during these celebrations. Vendors sold skewers of grilled meat called *obliskoi, dripping with juices and sprinkled with herbs. Children darted through the crowds, clutching sesame pastries and candied nuts. Potters would shape small clay cups on the spot, filling them with watered wine for those who came without their own vessel. Even the philosophers took a break from their rhetoric to enjoy a sweet or two. Music, dance, and food formed a single, unified rhythm. Drummers pounded, dancers spun, and the smell of roasted lamb blended with the perfume of flowers that were strewn across the streets. Some vendors would shout their praises to the gods while flipping fish over open flames. Others whispered prayers as they poured honey over hot cakes. To eat was to worship, to honor the divine through pleasure. As the sun sank behind the Acropolis, the festival's fires burned low, and the last of the vendors sold off what they could. Leftover bread and olives were given to beggars, and the rest was carried home in woven baskets. By nightfall, Athens was quiet again, its marble streets sticky with honey, its citizens full and content. In those fleeting hours, food became unity, a reminder that even in a city ruled by intellect and debate, joy still began with something as simple as a bite shared among neighbors. Though centuries have passed, the spirit of ancient Greek street food never truly disappeared. It simply evolved. The same smells that once drifted through the Agora still linger in the air of modern Mediterranean markets, honey warming over coals, oregano being crushed under the hand, and olive oil shimmering like liquid sunlight. The Athenians may be gone, but their philosophy of food, simple, communal, and deeply human, lives on. Street food in ancient Greece was never just about hunger. It was about connection. To eat from a vendor's hand was to take part in the rhythm of the city, to taste its soil, its trade routes, and its stories. The hum of the market was an orchestra, and the food was its melody. The fishermen, bakers, and farmers were not just merchants. They were the city's unseen poets, crafting small, edible verses of daily life. The olive, the chickpea, and the honey cake all carried the values of an entire civilization: moderation, harmony, and a deep respect for the natural world. Every meal, no matter how humble, reflected the Greek belief in balance, the idea that beauty and simplicity could coexist. It was food that demanded mindfulness, to be eaten slowly, savored, discussed, and even philosophized over. When the Romans later borrowed from Greek culture, they adopted much of this street food tradition. The markets of Rome were filled with echoes of Athens: grilled fish, bread dipped in oil, and sweet pastries soaked in honey. Even the word thermopolium, meaning hot food shop, carried the DNA of the Greek agora. Through trade and conquest, the Athenian idea of accessible, flavorful food spread across the ancient world, laying the foundation for the world's first fast food culture, one that prized not speed, but a shared experience. Today, when someone bites into a warm pita filled with herbs or drizzles honey over fried dough, they are unknowingly repeating a ritual that is thousands of years old. The flavors of sesame, olive, and lemon still whisper of marble streets and sunlit markets. The legacy of ancient Greek street food is not found in recipes, but in the philosophy it left behind. That food is democracy made visible, a celebration of simplicity, equality, and pleasure. In every single bite, the agora still breathes, eternal, fragrant, and alive. The Silk Road was not just one road, but 1,000 threads of dust and stone that stitched together the ancient world. From Chang'an in China to Antioch on the Mediterranean, it wound its way across mountains, deserts, and kingdoms like a living artery of trade and faith. It carried silk, yes, shimmering bolts that symbolized wealth and mystery, but it also carried stories, ideas, and the scent of faraway lands. To walk the Silk Road was to walk through the very veins of civilization itself. At dawn, the caravan would stir, bells tinkling on camel necks, and the desert wind carrying the low groan of animals rising under their heavy loads. Men wrapped their faces in cloth, shielding themselves from the dust. The leader of the caravanbashi asterisk, shouted orders in a mix of tongues: Persian, Sogdian, Turkic, Arabic, Chinese. Around him moved traders, monks, and guards, each with a different destination, yet all bound by the same purpose: to cross the void and survive. The desert was cruel and vast. The Taklamakan, whose name meant "you go in and never come out," stretched like an ocean of gold under a pitiless sun. The heat by day could boil the air, and at night frost would glitter on the sand. But the merchants endured it all, driven by the promise of fortune. A single bolt of Chinese silk could buy a Roman soldier's armor. A pouch of saffron was worth more than its weight in silver. Along the road stood the caravanserais, roadside inns that offered refuge from the endless sand. Here, merchants could eat, wash, and share tailies by the fire. One might meet a Greek scholar discussing astronomy with a Persian sage, while a Buddhist monk offered blessings to passing guards. Deals were made, stories were traded, and rumors spread faster than the wind. The Silk Road was not merely about commerce, it was about communion. Each caravan was a moving world unto itself. There were camels laden with spices and glassware, horses bearing scrolls and jade, and men carrying their dreams. As they moved, they wove invisible threads across continents, connecting cities, gods, and destinies. Long before ships or telegraphs, the Silk Road made the world one, not through conquest but through exchange. If the Silk Road was a living artery, then the merchants were its lifeblood, multilingual, shrewd, and endlessly adaptable. They came from every corner of the known world. Sogdians from Samarkand, Arabs from Damascus, Persians from Nishapur, and Han Chinese from the east. Each of them spoke in a blend of dialects, gestures, and smiles, bartering not only with goods but with trust. On this road, survival depended less on steel and more on the art of understanding. A good merchant could recognize the weight of gold by touch and the quality of silk by its sound. They were mathematicians without ledgers and linguists without schools. In the bazaars of Bukhara or Kashgar, they would sit cross-legged in shaded courtyards, counting coins from dozens of kingdoms while sipping green tea or fermented mare's milk. Around them, languages mixed like spices in a pot: Greek, Sanskrit, Mongolian, Persian, the true music of the Silk Road. The Sogdians, in particular, were masters of the route. They didn't merely sell, they connected worlds. Fluent in the tongues of both East and West, they acted as translators, guides, and diplomats. A Sogdian trader might leave Samarkand with bolts of silk and return months later with Roman glass, Indian pepper, and tales of strange temples and gods. They were the bridge builders, turning deserts into marketplaces and mountains into corridors of exchange. Trust was the currency that mattered most. There were no banks, no border patrols, no credit systems, only reputation. A broken promise could ruin a man faster than bandits ever could. To protect their deals, merchants relied on family networks that spanned thousands of miles. Letters written in elegant scripts traveled from oasis to oasis, sealed with wax and with faith. At night, when the campfires burned low, the merchants spoke not of profit but of stories, of sea monsters near India, of snow demons in the Pamirs, of golden cities waiting just beyond the dunes. Some were lies, others were half-truths, but they all kept the imagination alive across those endless miles. These men weren't just traders. They were the earliest global citizens, fluent in difference, comfortable in motion, and united by a shared hunger for discovery. The Silk Road didn't just sell goods, it sold possibility. Every journey on the Silk Road began and ended with one indispensable companion: the camel. Patient, stubborn, and uncomplaining, these beasts were the true ships of the desert, carrying the weight of empires across endless dunes. Without them, the Silk Road would have been little more than a dream buried beneath the sands. Two breeds ruled the route. The Bactrian camel, with its two shaggy humps, thrived in the cold winds of Central Asia, while the dromedary, with its one sleek hump, endured the heat of the southern deserts. Both could walk for days without water, carrying up to 500 pounds of silk, porcelain, or spices. Their long eyelashes and closing nostrils made them nearly invincible against the storming sands of the Taklamakan and the Gobi. Caravans often numbered in the hundreds of camels, each one tied nose to tail in an unbroken line that stretched like a serpent across the horizon. The caravanbashi asterisk or leader would ride at the front, setting the pace. Behind him came the guards, then the traders, and finally the cooks and laborers. Each animal had its place, a hierarchy of hooves. Even the sound of their steps created a rhythm, a heartbeat of trade that pulsed across the continent of Asia. The camels were treated with a kind of reverence. Before setting out, handlers would decorate them with bells, tassels, and colorful cloths, not for vanity, but to ward off evil spirits that were said to dwell in the desert. In many cultures, the camel was considered sacred. In Persia, it symbolized endurance. In China, it appeared in tomb carvings as a sign of wealth and adventure. Yet the relationship was not without its hardship. The desert was merciless. Blinding sandstorms could scatter entire caravans, and freezing nights could kill both men and beasts. When that happened, travelers would build small stone mounds beside the bones, silent graves for the loyal dead. At the rest stops, the caravanserais echoed with their groans as they knelt down to be unloaded. The smell of sweat, hay, and spice filled the air. Men would sing to them to calm them, knowing that a panic could destroy the entire expedition. For centuries, these creatures carried the treasures of the world: silk from China, glass from Rome, incense from Arabia. They never knew what they bore or why they were bearing it, yet their slow, steady steps connected continents. In their shadows, the Silk Road moved forward, one hoofprint at a time. Scattered across the vast emptiness of Asia stood the caravanserais, fortified inns that offered weary travelers a brief refuge from the brutality of the road. To those who were crossing the desert, these way stations were more than just shelter. They were lifelines. Built every 20 to 30 miles, each one marked the distance a camel could travel before exhaustion. Between their walls, the Silk Road would pause to breathe. From the outside, a caravanserai looked like a small fortress, with thick mud brick walls, heavy wooden gates, and narrow windows designed to repel thieves. But inside, life flourished. Merchants, monks, guards, and animals all shared the same courtyard. The sound of clinking harnesses, boiling tea, and laughter filled the night air. The scent of spices, sweat, and roasting meat mingled together beneath the stars. Upon arrival, the gates would close with a heavy thud, sealing the travelers safely within. The courtyard bustled with motion as camels knelt while their loads were removed. Servants fetched water from the wells, and traders stretched their cramped legs. Around the edges of the courtyard were small rooms for sleeping and for storing goods, while an elevated platform at the center often served as both a dining area and a trading floor. By evening, the fires were lit, and stories were shared over bowls of rice, lentils, and dried fruits. These talis traveled faster than the goods themselves. A Persian carpet dealer might dine beside a Chinese monk, while a Turkic guard listened to a Roman merchant describe the faraway sea. Languages collided, ideas intertwined, and rumors took wing. Some caravanserais even doubled as post stations where messengers delivered letters between empires, the first sparks of global communication. Hospitality was sacred along the Silk Road. It was said that a guest who entered a caravanserai was protected by God for 3 nights, and no one asked questions of creed or kingdom. Survival simply erased such divisions. Even enemies would share a meal under those roofs. At dawn, as the gates creaked open, the caravans would depart one by one, vanishing back into the desert. Behind them, the innkeepers would sweep the courtyards, awaiting the next weary souls. These stone refugees became the very heartbeat of the Silk Road, islands of safety in an ocean of sand. Within their walls, empires met as equals, bound not by war or by a crown, but by the shared need for warmth, food, and a place to dream before the next horizon. For every fortune that was made on the Silk Road, there were countless others that never reached their destination. Behind the romance of spice-laden caravans and golden fabrics lay a journey that was ruled by danger, bandits, deserts, disease, and despair. The path from Samarkand to Kashgar was as perilous as it was profitable. Bandits haunted the mountain passes and the desert edges. Traveling caravans would hire armed guards or even mercenaries, men who were hardened by the road and quick with a blade. Some bandit gangs were just desperate villagers, while others were organized raiders who demanded taxes in exchange for safe passage. To be caught unprepared was to vanish. Goods stolen, travelers slain, and camels sold in the next town as if nothing had happened. But nature, too, was an enemy. The Taklamakan Desert, the Sea of Death, stretched for hundreds of miles with absolutely no mercy. Travelers would mark the way with bones or cairns of stones, but the shifting sands would bury all traces. Sandstorms could rise without any warning, darkening the sky and suffocating both man and beast. Those who strayed even a little from the path were simply swallowed whole. Water was life. Caravans meticulously planned their journeys around the oases, those fragile dots of green that kept the Silk Road alive. The names of these places, Merv, Turpan, Dunhuang, became legends, whispered by travelers like prayers. Reaching one meant survival, missing one meant doom. Many who failed to find them became ghost stories told around the fires at night. Illness followed the travelers like a persistent shadow. New climates brought new diseases, and a fever caught in Persia might be carried all the way to China. Yet, in this exchange of sickness came another gift: the spread of medicine. Greek doctors traded herbs with Indian healers, and Chinese physicians taught pulse diagnosis to Arabs. Knowledge, much like silk, was a cargo of great value. Even simple exhaustion could kill. The nights in the high Pamirs could freeze skin in minutes, while the days in the desert would crack it like leather. The strong learned to walk without complaint, to conserve their breath and their thoughts. And yet, despite every single peril, the caravans kept moving. The road devoured lives, but it birthed legends. For those who crossed it, the Silk Road was not merely a matter of geography. It was a trial of faith, of courage, and of endurance, a test written in sand and stone. Amid the emptiness of the Silk Road, there were cities that shone like mirages, islands of life in a sea of dust. Samarkand, Merv, Bukhara, Kashgar, and Dunhuang. Their very names carried the weight of wonder. To reach one of these after weeks in the desert was to step out of silence and into music, out of death and into color. These oases were not only lifelines for travelers, they were the beating hearts of civilization itself. Each city was a crossroads of worlds. Samarkand, the glittering gem of Sogdiana, was a city of domes and markets where Persian poets, Chinese scholars, and Arab traders bargained beneath the same blue tiles. Perfume sellers offered rose oil beside spice merchants from India, and you could hear 10 different languages in a single street, none of them needing translation once the haggling began. Bukhara was known for its libraries and its schools. Caravans would pause there not only to trade goods, but also to trade knowledge. Buddhist monks shared space with Nestorian Christians, while Zoroastrian priests debated philosophy in shaded courtyards. The smell of ink mixed with the scent of cumin and smoke. Knowledge itself became a form of commerce. Further east lay Kashgar, nestled where the Tian Shan Mountains met the desert. Its bazaars overflowed with silk, porcelain, turquoise, and horses. The bells of the caravans echoed through narrow lanes as traders replenished their supplies before facing the treacherous passes ahead. In the evenings, musicians would play the asterisk deuter and sing of distant lands, songs that seemed to carry the wind of the whole Silk Road within them. Dunhuang, perched at the very edge of the Gobi, was more than just an oasis. It was a sanctuary. Its famous Magao caves, carved into cliffs of stone, were filled with painted Buddhas, celestial dancers, and the prayers of travelers. Merchants would leave offerings there before venturing into the desert, hopping for a safe passage. In these cities, ideas traveled even faster than silk. Greek astronomy met Indian medicine, and Persian art mingled with Chinese brushwork. Every exchange, a coin, a spice, a word, left an imprint. To rest in an oasis city was to glimpse what the Silk Road truly was, a bridge between worlds, a place where dust and divinity met, where every street corner whispered that the world was far larger and far more connected than anyone had ever imagined. The Silk Road carried not just silk and spices, it carried souls. Along its winding paths, faiths would meet, mingle, and transform. From Buddhist monks in saffron robes to Nestorian priests clutching crosses, from Zoroastrian fire worshippers to wandering Sufi mystics, the road became a moving temple where belief itself was a form of trade. The Buddhists were among the earliest travelers of faith. From India, they journeyed northward through the passes of the Himalayas and into the oases of Central Asia. Monks established monasteries in Merv, Balkh, and Dunhuang, carving shrines into cliffs and painting stories of the Buddha on the walls. These sanctuaries served not only as places of worship, but also as rest stops for weary travelers. Merchants, regardless of their own religion, were welcome to share food, shelter, and safety, the true currency of compassion. Farther west, Zoroastrians tended to eternal flames in Persia, teaching of light and darkness, of good and evil, ideas that would later influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Their temples glowed like beacons for passing caravans, offering a reminder that even in the desert, the fire of faith never died. With time came the Christians, particularly the Nestorians, who carried their version of the gospel eastward. They built churches in Samarkand and Kashgar, where crosses stood beside Buddhist stupas and Zoroastrian altars. These communities thrived in diversity, a rare experiment in coexistence. The road taught tolerance not by decree, but by necessity. A merchant couldn't afford to despise a man whose help he might need at the next oasis. Then came the Muslims, their caravans spreading not only goods but also the rhythm of prayer. The call to prayer echoed across caravanserais from Baghdad to Bukhara. Islam, with its emphasis on charity, hospitality, and trade, found fertile ground among the merchants who already lived by those very same virtues. And yet, for all their differences, these faiths shared the same wind, the same dust, and the same hope of safety on the endless road. Pilgrims and traders would pray side by side under the same stars, trusting that their gods, however they were named, watched over them equally. The Silk Road was not merely a route of commerce. It was a pilgrimage of humanity, where belief became both a burden and a bridge, linking hearts across continents. Every caravan that creaked along the Silk Road carried more than just goods. It carried dreams, the very essence of what one world desired from another. Each bundle, jar, or bolt of fabric told a story of distance and longing. In the dry air of the desert, smells and colors became a form of currency. The clinking of coins was only half the music of trade. The other half was the rustle of silk and the whisper of spice. Silk was the treasure that gave the road its name. It was as light as breath and stronger than any other cloth, and it dazzled those who saw it for the first time. In Rome, it was said that senators gasped when they held Chinese silk up to the light, watching it shimmer like water. To own it was to wear the East itself. Entire empires rose and fell trying to control its flow, yet no army could ever stop the caravans. Silk traveled farther and faster than kings ever could. Then there were the spices, saffron from Persia, cinnamon from India, and cloves from Indonesia. These tiny fragments of the earth were worth more than gold. In the cold markets of the West, they brought warmth and memory, the taste of sunlight, the scent of summer. A handful of peppercorns could buy a slave, and a pouch of saffron could buy a horse. To carry such things across deserts was to carry temptation itself. But not all treasures glittered or burned. Some were fragile, like ideas and stories, traded in words rather than in weight. Travelers would swap tales of sea monsters near India, of fire-breathing mountains beyond China, and of phoenixes rising from Arabian sands. From these exaggerations grew legends, myths that traveled even faster than the caravans themselves. Paper and ink joined the trade, too. Buddhist sutras were copied in one land and translated in another. Persian poets found their verses carved in Chinese calligraphy. Scholars at the caravanserais would share maps, medicines, and philosophies, with each discovery becoming a new strand in the growing web of human knowledge. By the time a caravan reached its journey's end, its wares had already changed hands, languages, and meanings. What began as silk in China might end as a scripture in Byzantium. What left the East as a spice might return as a perfume. On the Silk Road, everything, even truth, was traded, shaped, and reborn long after the last camel bell had faded into silence. The Silk Road remained not as a trail of sand, but as an idea. It had accomplished what no empire ever could. It connected humanity across 3 continents. It bound strangers into neighbors, merchants into messengers, and faiths into a conversation. Though the caravans eventually vanished, their echoes lived on in language, art, and the mingled bloodlines of those who once walked beneath its burning sun. The road changed the world quietly. It was not built by kings, but by ordinary people, traders, monks, weavers, and wanderers. They didn't conquer with armies, they conquered with curiosity. From them came the exchange of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and art. Gunpowder traveled westward from China, while glass-making and paper-making traveled east. In its wake, civilizations evolved not in isolation, but in dialogue. The cities that once thrived along the route, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, became living museums, their minarets and mosaics whispering of the golden days when caravans passed through their gates. Even centuries later, the architecture of Europe, the calligraphy of Persia, and the porcelain of China all bore the fingerprints of one another. The Silk Road had made culture itself a shared inheritance, but time is a patient eraser. As maritime trade grew, the great land route began to fade. Ships could carry more than camels, and the ocean, though dangerous, had fewer bandits than the desert. Yet, even as the sand reclaimed its paths, the spirit of the Silk Road refused to die. It lived on in new forms in the exchange of ideas, inventions, and the human connection that defines our modern world. Today, historians trace its roots not just in maps, but in our languages and our customs. The words we speak, the foods we eat, the fabrics we wear, all of it carries faint echoes of that ancient highway. A bolt of silk in Italy, a cup of tea in London, a string of prayer beads in Tibet, all descend from the same great river of exchange. The Silk Road proved something profound. That distance is not a barrier, only a bridge waiting to be crossed. It showed that trade could build peace, that curiosity could unite worlds, and that even across deserts of silence, humanity would always find its way back to conversation.